I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Fresh off the plane from Israel, John Stonestreet speaks with Andrew Walker about celebrity conversions, specifically the conversion of Kanye West. How should we as Christians respond? Walker shares his observations, and that he's encouraged by what he's hearing so far from West about his approach to Scripture, his concern for his family, and his regret over the lifestyle he's promoted in the past. Andrew Walker, formerly of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, is now Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Apologetics at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, as well as Associate Dean of Theology and the Director of the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. Here are John Stonestreet and Andrew Walker.
Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast. Now, before we begin our conversation today, which I think will be really interesting, at least to me, I'm interested in this conversation, I need to give two caveats. The first one is that I'm doing this right after getting back from Israel, and I had a great 10 days over there with a group called the Israel Collective and a bunch of worldview and apologist friends for the last 10 days, got to take my wife, all of that's fantastic, but I'm a little bit jet lagged, so if I say anything that's ridiculous, that's going to be my excuse. And the second disclaimer or caveat is about my guest, Andrew Walker. And I don't even know how to introduce him, and I'm not sure he knows how to be introduced because he's right in between two gigs, formerly with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. In fact, he's recording this on what would be his last official day and headed to Southern Seminary. But Andrew, you've been on the program before. Tell people about your new gig at Southern Seminary, and I haven't had a chance to tell you this. Congratulations.
Hey, John, thanks a lot. It's good to be with you again. Yeah, so starting tomorrow, November 1st, I'll be starting out anew at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, as an associate professor of Christian ethics and apologetics. I'm an associate dean in the School of Theology, and then leading an on-campus think tank called the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. So I've got my plate full and ready to get going, and I'm in the middle of getting my family transitioned up to Louisville, so it's an exciting time.
Well, hey, I know that's a lot to be thinking about, and so I'm grateful that you took the time. And since you mentioned Carl Henry, the breakpoint that we had on the topic that you and I are going to talk about, which is Kanye West, I put together a commentary that referenced not only Kanye West and Chuck Colson, but also Carl Henry. So, hey, this circle just keeps going round and round and round.
I need to read that commentary or see it.
Yeah, well, listen, it goes out actually after we're recording it, but before people will be listening to this podcast, and that's how the dynamics here work. But it's good. I wanted to talk to you because obviously the story of last week, from start to finish, in many ways, there was a lot of stories, but one of them was this, what we might call a celebrity conversion. Maybe as far as celebrities go, however you rank celebrities, I'm not sure there's a standard definition of how to rank celebrities, but Kanye West is about as big as it gets. There's been rumblings for the last, several months to maybe even more than a year about this newfound faith of his, performing these concerts that he calls Sunday services. But really, in light of dropping this new music project, releasing this, I guess you would say, a digital album called Jesus is King. And where was the last time we heard that phrase, Jesus is King, proclaimed more? When was the last time that was trending on Twitter? Let's put it that way. It's just been a remarkable week, and it brings up a lot of these questions. And you wrote a terrific article that I saw while I was in Israel on National Review called Conway's Conversion Could Be a Cultural Wrecking Ball. And by the way, I just want to say, nice search engine optimization. Not only put Kanye West there, but put Wrecking Ball, which if our listeners don't know is a reference to a Miley Cyrus song. That was optimized, dude. I was impressed by that. But it was a terrific article and a take. So give us a synopsis. And there's so much for us to talk about here, but give us a synopsis of your reaction to this news and why you wrote the piece.
Well, I'm actually astonished. Like you, I have heard rumblings for several months now that something profound spiritually had been happening in the life of Kanye West. And, I will admit that I was originally one of those individuals who was a little bit skeptical because often we hear about celebrity conversions and either they don't last or, someone is converted to a very kind of nominalist or moral therapeutic deism type of Christianity. And so I initially was one to kind of have a little bit of skepticism. And then I listened to the album, and then previous to the album, I was reading news articles and hearing the type of language that Kanye West was describing his faith in. And I was becoming familiar with the individual who is, I believe, his pastor now, Adam Tyson, and then listening to some of what Tyson is preaching at these Sunday services. And it's incredibly biblical, and it's incredibly evangelical and conversionary in nature. And so I have to honestly repent in my own heart a little bit of my initial skepticism, because as one of my friends commented, who wrote an article at Christianity Today, skepticism ought not be the default response to hearing about someone's conversion. And so I am rejoicing in what I think appears to be a very genuine expression of faith. In his media interviews with the album, Kanye West has been over the top insisting upon he's living his life for Christ.
Well, I was just saying, yeah, I mean, he's said it on Jimmy Kimmel now. He said it on, it's usually a carpool karaoke with James Corden, but I think this time it was an airplane pool. Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable thing. And what you're saying here, Andrew, reminds me a lot of a piece. I want our listeners to come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. I'll link you to Andrew Walker's piece. I'll also link you to a piece that's on our Breakpoint site by our resident curmudgeon. I'm just kidding. He's our theological, cynical voice, Shane Morris. If you follow Shane, he's a terrific writer. He's also the co-host on Breakpoint This Week with me. And he wrote a terrific piece. And Andrew, the kind of that initial skepticism that kind of wore down into a level of hopefulness, it also characterized the piece that he wrote. But look, there's been a lot of celebrity conversions, right? I mean, there's been a lot of them, from athletes to musicians. Snoop Dogg put out a Christian rap album not that long ago, and that one doesn't seem to have stuck in any sort of, real way. Is there not a room, at least for a little bit of healthy, skepticism? Let's wait and see. What do you think?
I think there could be some level of appropriate skepticism, just because Kanye West has by nature been an unpredictable figure with evolving identities the longer that his career has gone on. But I also know that he is someone who has very publicly done battle with his own mental illness and his own demons. And he is, I feel like, processing those realities in profound new ways in light of his newfound conversion and his newfound faith in Christ. And so whatever appropriate levels of skepticism might be there, I don't think that ought to be the default reaction. It ought to be something that we are first and foremost responding with joy and excitement and giving God glory for saving someone, but then also hoping that, Kanye West is surrounding himself with godly disciplers who are helping him think about his new faith through a biblical worldview. So I think we obviously, as is the case with anyone who becomes a Christian, we want to see their life bear fruit. But I will be honest, in the short time that I've seen Kanye West's faith, there's been tremendous fruit. And just to come back to his album a little bit, he's talking about the need to be a godly husband and father. In certain interviews, he's been talking about how he regrets contributing to the over-sexualization of culture. He's been criticizing the need to put down your Instagram and pray with your family instead, that he wants to live his life for Christ, and if that means against the culture, so be it. And so there's some really profound remarks coming out of his mouth in these interviews. That
was one of the things I appreciate about your piece, is the kind of the fruit that went along with it, at least in his views. And a lot of people have talked about one of those things in particular that he said. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But one of the things that I brought up on the Breakpoint that aired on Friday was how much so many of us were reminded of, well, when you say celebrity conversion, I mean, the Colson Center was founded by a celebrity conversion, right? I mean, Chuck Colson, very different kind. And I made the joke that, there's probably no other way that Kanye West reminds us of Chuck Colson, in any possible way. But that was one of the interesting things. And that, there was a lot of skepticism about the timing of it, right? That, the conversion came awfully close to Watergate, and, this is a get out of jail free card, which obviously it wasn't. And this was a way for him to get back into public graces, which it didn't. And even the Washington Post, 35 years after his conversion, still expressed skepticism about it in their obituary to Chuck Colson, which was one of the stunning things about it. but it means you have to have hope. But one of the things that you mentioned I think is really important is that Chuck's life was marked by this ongoing desire to be discipled. Carl Henry, who you mentioned earlier, was one of his theological advisors, was the first theological advisor to the Prison Fellowship Board. Timothy George also was a theological advisor, and so that spans his whole life. Timothy George, Carl Henry from the very beginning. And there were others, in between. And Chuck Colson's desire to be in church and so on and so on. And that was one of the things that has been encouraging to me. What was, and you mentioned this quickly, the reports about the guy who's kind of become a pastor to him. He's been attending church there. I mean, that guy graduated from the Master's College and the Master's Seminary, which is a very conservative, theologically speaking school in California. I mean, we're not talking about what we might call, health and prosperity, which we've seen in some other celebrity conversions, or some, really kind of pop evangelical, but not theologically very informed-ish sorts of churches. I listened to a pretty long interview with the pastor, and it was funny. The interviewer started by theologically grilling the pastor, and he answered in a way that you and I hopefully would answer those same questions. So it does seem to be a difference here, doesn't it?
It does, certainly. And as you mentioned, I believe the pastor, whose name's Adam Tyson, he's a graduate of the institutions affiliated with John MacArthur. And we all know John MacArthur's kind of stalwart biblical fidelity through the entirety of his 50-plus career. And so I think, again, time is going to tell about what happens, but we should be encouraged right now. And one of the things I wrote about in my article that I'm really interested to see what happens is because Kanye West is such a cultural icon. I mean, one of the most famous people alive today, certainly, or in this century, one of the most famous people alive. If he turns and lives a biblical worldview, he will really be able to challenge a lot of the unchecked kind of cultural progressivism that is just the default in our elite sectors of media and celebrity and in the entertainment industry. And so I really do think that, given this emphasis on the family that he's returning to, the need to pray with his family, he mentioned in one of the interviews that he regrets how provocatively he has allowed his wife and his daughter to dress. And so I just really interested to see the long-term impact of Kanye West, because we live in a culture where it's kind of a moral free-for-all. You do your thing, you do you, as we're often told. And Kanye West is a living testament to the unfulfilling nature of living that lifestyle, because he writes about how money and fame and sex and power were not sufficient to make him ultimately happy. And so, again, we should rejoice at what we're saying.
One of the things that many people have made a lot of is a statement that Kanye made in terms of being pro-life. And he didn't really say it in those terms. He just said, look, for a long time, we've been encouraged as African Americans to kill our own babies and so on. And a whole lot has been made of that comment. Do you think Kanye is pro-life?
I can't speak to his absolute convictions, but I'm going to assume, given his willingness to defy political correctness and given his willingness to identify in some sorts of political conservatism, especially with his support for President Trump, and with that comment that he made on an interview, I would be willing to say it seems like he's trending in that direction. Again, which is to me evidence potentially of something authentic taking place, because we believe as Christians that all humans are made in God's image, and a submission of your mind and your views to biblical authority is going to always unquestionably, unequivocally lead you to a pro-life perspective. So I don't know if Kanye West has the finer points of his theology worked out when it comes to human dignity. But again, initial comments seem like he's trending in a positive direction.
Yeah. One of the things I think that has happened when a celebrity conversion like this happens is one of two things, right? One is that we immediately turn them into theological experts. I can remember so many big-time NFL players who made a public profession to Christ when I was in college, I think, or young 20s, and then they were in the pulpit the next Sunday. I remember, much was made of MC Hammer back in the day, and immediately he was held up and sent in to preach. And that's one mistake. And the other mistake is really kind of sitting back and going, well, we'll just see if they make it, right? If they make it, then we'll claim them. But of course, no Christian can make it if they're not embraced by the church and if they're not committed to the church. We all need the church, and Kanye needs the church. And I think that those are two things that are always a risk, is kind of propping someone up and expecting theological precision too soon, or not expecting any theological precision, right?
Sure. And I think what we need to do here is take the advice of the Apostle Paul, who warns against new believers being puffed up. And so we should not be deferring to Kanye West for the finer points of our theology. What we need to be praying for Kanye West is that in these initial stages of his faith, that he's being discipled, that he's reading the Bible, which he said in an interview that what he does in the evening now, because he loves being home with his family, is that while the family watches TV, he reads his Bible. So that's what we want to hope for. So let's allow Kanye to be a Christian without becoming a Christian celebrity and kind of the Christian media complex latching onto him to make him kind of a mascot for a cause. And I think we should also be cautious against converting him into kind of a useful political tool. So we should not look to him to be a Constantine who's going to re-Christianize the culture. If positive impact happens because of his witness, let's give glory to God. But we as Christians need to be restrained or chastened in what we attach to Kanye West and care more about his soul and his discipleship and sanctification more than about Christian cultural insecurities that we often have in a culture. Because sometimes when someone great cultural fame converts, Christians think, oh, see, people are like us, as we're not as weird as we think we are because someone of certain fame is a Christian too. I understand that. I understand the desire to kind of impute our insecurities onto someone who's famous. But that's not a New Testament way of looking at what conversion is. We should be amazed that God saves anyone at all, regardless of their socioeconomic status or their cultural fame. And this is a Galatians 3:28 type of reality, that at the cross we're all equal. And so let Kanye, in effect, be Kanye before he's anything else, as a cultural figure, as a Christian celebrity, or as a political figure.
Yeah, I agree. That's such an important point. And that's one of the things I mentioned on Breakpoint as well. It's like, that's the great news about Christianity, is that when it comes to what we celebrate, when a convert becomes a convert, it's not the convert, it's the converter, right? It's not Kanye, it's Christ. And if the reason I think God can reach across Kanye's craziness and save him through Christ is because he reached across my craziness and saved me, right? And is it really that much more astounding that God does that sort of stuff? Hey, Andrew, it's been a great conversation. I think you wrote just a terrific article. And I want to ask you about one more kind of unrelated topic here, but since I got you, right before you and I kind of went on air here to record this, we got some really encouraging news out of Kentucky, which is where you're at, where you will soon be. I guess you're not there yet, but you will soon be there at Louisville. Yeah, Blaine Adamson, who's a client of the Alliance Defending Freedom, has had a long-running legal situation because of refusing to print messages on T-shirts. He makes T-shirts for refusing to print messages that go against his strongly held convictions. Hands-On Originals is the name of his business. The Kentucky Supreme Court just ruled in his favor. This is another win for free speech. And when it comes to religious freedom and the challenge with sexual issues in our culture, give us quickly a synopsis of what this means.
I think, I haven't read the opinion myself yet, but there's a unanimous ruling, as you said, that the Kentucky Supreme Court is agreeing that, again, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems, for one, that his free speech was violated, and then two, there were issues of standing about whether or not he was rightfully sued in the first place. So I think this is, regardless of how broad or how narrow the ruling is, it's a win. And I think conservatives and Christians need to celebrate where we can celebrate, that the First Amendment is doing what the First Amendment was designed to do. It's resilient. It's pushing back against the forces of coercion and intolerance. And so as conservatives are having these debates about the merits of the First Amendment, we need to look at cases like this and say, were it not for the First Amendment and ideas like viewpoint neutrality and the argument that you can't compel someone to engage in conduct or speech that they disagree with, we find ourselves going back to these essential principles of what makes America America. So I would encourage everyone on listening to go read up on this case. It's a really important blockbuster case that could have massive precedent down the line. And for today, we don't know if it's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court, but for today, it's a win. So let's celebrate it.
Yeah, let's celebrate it. And like you said, I mean, look, if the Civil Rights Commission that took this complaint on got their hands slapped for wrongfully spending so much money and time, and also just trying essentially, when it comes to Blaine Adamson, to just kind of intimidate and that sort of thing. I mean, think of how many Americans are intimidated just by the threat of this. You know, Jack Phillips has been in this thing for over 7 years. And if there's a hand slap over, you just can't go around suing anybody you want over this, then that's going to be a huge win as well. And I need to take a closer look at the opinion. But come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. My guest today has been Andrew Walker, formerly of ERLC, headed to Southern Seminary to be a professor there and head of the Carl F.H. Henry Center there. We've been talking about Kanye West. Come to breakpoint.org. We'll link you to the articles and resources that we mentioned on the podcast today. Andrew, congrats again on the move. Thanks for this terrific article, and thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
John, thanks a lot. It's been great to be with you as always.
You've been listening to Colson Center President John Stonestreet and Andrew Walker. Before I leave you today, I wanted to let you know that registration is now open for the 2020 Wilberforce Weekend, the nation's premier annual Christian Worldview Conference. This year's theme, Truth and Love Together. More than ever, our culture needs Christians who understand that to be fully human is to know the truth, love the truth, and live the truth. Wilberforce Weekend 2020 is a rare opportunity to learn from our trademark lineup of transformative speakers, including Oz Guinness, Lee Strobel, and Andy Crouch, and then to connect with hundreds of dynamic people who are living out a Christian worldview in your cities and mission fields with compassion and courage. Wilberforce Weekend 2020 takes place May 14th through 17th at the Gateway Marriott in Arlington, Virginia, right across the river from the nation's capital. And this year, we have special a la carte pricing options in case you can't stay for the whole weekend. It's going to be an incredible event, and I hope to meet you there. Come to wilberforceweekend.org to register. That's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.